Salutations, tubers. Welcome back to that room for our continuing series on white classification for steam locomotives. This time we shall be covering 8-drivered engines, following on our previous videos about 6 and 4-drivered engines. So if you haven't seen those, I'd recommend you go watch them and then come back so you're all caught up. And I guess without further ado, we'll be getting right into it. We'll be starting off with this, the 080 wheel arrangement. This is primarily a heavy switcher design, tended to be used in big classification yards. I think the Norfolk and Western was pretty fond of these. This is actually what's called a USRA standard design. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the United States Railroad Administration was created during World War I, where the United States government briefly took control of all the railroads in North America, in the United States, because they were afraid they wouldn't work together to be able to support the war effort. And as a part of that takeover, they issued a series of standard locomotives to do all the different jobs on the railroad, to be made by all locomotive builders, and basically create the closest there could ever be to a generic locomotive. So this is one of the designs. Very common for Lionel to include these in train sets, but so far as I know, there weren't too many of these in use. So I'm pretty sure the Norfolk and Western favored these for use in heavy marshalling yards. Small drivers indicates this is definitely a freight locomotive. I imagine you could use this for road service, but like every other switch engine design, the lack of a forward and trailing truck means this thing tends to bounce and jounce around on the rails, making it unstable at high speed. Another place you'll tend to see this is in the Railroader PC game. They have a version of this available that you can buy for all your switching and freight needs. So there we are, the 080. We'll move on up to the next locomotive up the list. Okay, next off we have the 280 consolidation. This type gets its name from the first locomotive of the type ever built, which was named Consolidation, built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works. These were pretty well freight locomotives through and through. They were made to go pull stiff grades in the early days. It's not to say you never saw a Consolidation ever pull a passenger train, but these were primarily for getting the tonnage up over the hills. Another stalwart of the early days of railroad, and this particular one, kind of genericized, but given the Belpaire firebox and so on, I'd say this is an engine circa about 1920. Consolidation. Okay, next up on the list is this, which is the 282, the Mikado type. Gets its name from the fact big batch of these were sent over to the Empire of Japan, and Mikado is kind of a poetic synonym for the emperor. Pretty sure I have that right, so any of my Japanese speaking members of the audience, if you know better, please feel free to correct me in the comments. Be happy to receive such a correction. But another big factor was there was a very popular play at the time called The Mikado, which kind of played off all of that, so these tended to be called Mikados. When during the Second World War, of course, there was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment flowing around, so the railroad men tended to call these things Mikes. And there was a push to rename the type the MacArthur after General Douglas MacArthur, but it never really caught on. So, and gradually, as things simmered down, these things eventually went back to being called Mikados, but there's still plenty of old hands out there I know of who still call these things Mikes. This is kind of a general all-purpose locomotive. This particular one has got kind of mid-sized drivers, so it'd be good for just about any work. Most of the narrow gauge engines you see these days out on like the Cumbres and Toltec And the Durango and Silverton happen to be Mikados. They're just narrow gauge Mikados. This particular example represents a Texas and Pacific Mikado. Not particularly certain about the numbering on this one, so it might be open to a bit of interpretation. But as I'm a Mopac man, it's about the closest I could find to a Missouri Pacific steam engine, so that's why this particular engine's in the fleet. So, Mikado, moving on. Okay, next up we have the 284, the Berkshire type. We've got a pair of Berkshires to show this time. As a development of the Mikado, in fact, when these things were first introduced, one of the nicknames for them was Big Mikes, because they were essentially a Mikado with one extra trailing wheel to make the firebox bigger, so you could produce more steam and get more power. The Lima Locomotive Works was a big proponent of that. They called that superpower. In fact, this happens to be a Lima Berkshire right here. Another kind of general purpose locomotive, tended to be good all-rounders. As in general with any steam locomotive, the short-drivered ones are better at pulling power, tend to go into freight service. The ones with high drivers are made for speed. And something like this with drivers in the middle is kind of mixed traffic. So it's got a good turn of speed, but good pulling power, so we've got a bit of a compromise. One development we didn't cover, because I don't have a model of one in the collection presently, is the 480, which is called the 12-wheeler, or the Mastodon. Norfolk and Western 475, that's out of Strasburg. That's a Mastodon. That's one example you can look up if you want to see what one of those looks like. So I guess moving along. So moving right along, we have the 484 Northern. Got several Northerns in the collection, but these happen to be two of them. One design we kind of missed out on, because again, we don't have a model of it in the collection here, is the 482 Mountain. Frisco 1522 was a mountain type, is a mountain type locomotive, so you can have a gander at her, excuse me, if you want to see what a mountain looks like. So the 484 Northern, kind of widely considered to be the pinnacle of conventional steam locomotive development, got its name from the Northern Pacific, purportedly ordered the first one. Another all-rounder style design, good for both passenger and freight work. These two particular engines need no introduction. This is 4449, famous for pulling the Daylight and the Freedom Train. And this is 844, FEF3 from the Union Pacific, holds the distinction of only steam locomotive never to have been retired. But before we close out the video, I have one last 8-drivered locomotive, just going to be a little bit unconventional. But to round out the conventional ones, we have the 484 Northern here. Okay, so to round off our little view of 8-drivered locomotives, and to kind of cover as a penultimate part of the video series, since I don't have any 10-drivered locomotives for this particular layout. And obviously there were locomotives that went up all the way up to 12 drivers, like the 4122 Union Pacific types, and plenty of others I don't have available. I thought I would cover the last of the 8-drivered locomotives, and also cover a kind of a side question some of y'all might have. But to start off, this is a 686 locomotive, and in case you might be noticing, you don't see any pistons, and you don't see any valve gear assembly on the outside. Well, this is a steam turbine locomotive. Operates a bit differently than the conventional the piston powered steam locomotive. Only one of these ever built. It was called the S2 type locomotive. It was built by the Pennsylvania Railroad. It's kind of an effort to see if the steam locomotive could be further developed. In North America, turbine locomotives really didn't catch on too well in the steam format. A little bit later on, the Union Pacific played around with gas turbines, which is basically a jet engine that's geared to spin the shaft more than push a bunch of stuff out the back for thrust. And they basically operate like a diesel electric locomotive. I think it's the only nation that had any luck with steam turbines. I think it was the Swedish. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's called an M3T. They use those in freight service. They were geared to go slow. But the S2 here, it was kind of built to be a passenger locomotive, and it didn't really work too well. The main problem with a turbine locomotive is that the steam turbine is most efficient when it's at speed, and a railroad locomotive isn't always at speed. You got to slow down to make station stops. You got to go in the yard, etc., etc. It might have been a little bit better had they not been quite so clever with the design or geared it to go a little bit slower to be a freight engine. But the World War II was coming on, so they didn't really have a lot of resources to mess with it. So there's only one of these that was ever made. Of course, in model land, the S2 is a very popular model, so you're going to see way more of these than ever existed for the real deal, because Lionel made the turbine like this one here, and they've subsequently been reproduced many, many times. Now, to kind of round off the collection of oddballs, we have this, and it kind of sparks an obvious question. Well, are diesel locomotives classified by wheel arrangement? The answer is kind of yes and no. Usually, diesel locomotives tend to be classified by their model number, and in some cases, they'll use the European classification to tell you how many wheels are in the powered truck and which of them are powered, etc., etc. I'm not going to be going into that too much. But with something like this, which is actually another turbine locomotive, this is a gas turbine locomotive the U.S. Army played around with for a little bit. It has got cute connecting rods. So this would actually be classified a 242 Columbia, just like a steam locomotive. And there are diesel switch engines, or shunters as they call them over in Europe and the UK, that have coupling rods just like a steam locomotive. And one of these days I might do a little video about early diesel power and early experiments like this, where they actually took design elements from the steam locomotive into these new forms of locomotive, because they essentially didn't know what else to go from. But if it's a diesel or an electric and it's got coupling rods, you can actually classify them just like a steam locomotive. So I guess in conclusion, the next and final video in the series will be briefly covering articulated locomotives. And as always, you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment box down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I guess that'll be all for this time. I'll see you next time.